Hi, today on the workbench we have a NuTone model N2561, N2562. This particular unit, which was sent in by a fellow named Al, was manufactured in March of 1967. Al reported that the set has a low frequency hum on it all the time, which would not be unusual. The normal course of repair around here when a set comes in, we always set it all up and connect it to a little mini system, and we bench test it first to see what we've got before we start, because that way we know if we're on the right track and we can see the difference of the before and after. This is going to be really short because Al said has a low frequency hum. So I had it all set up, I went to turn it on, and this is what we get. That's quite the low frequency hum. This is actually somewhat unusual for a 2561-62. Usually when they come in, they're simply what I call old and tired. They work to some degree, not really as well as they should, and they have all of their share of little old and tired problems, but most of the time not as nearly of a dramatic failure as this one particularly has. So I thought I would show this off because it's a little bit different and out of the ordinary for this model. So we'll call this N2561, N2562 failure mode number 1. A big ginormous hum on the system all the time. That's all. There might be a part 2. After I get it fixed, I'll let you see how it works. Other than that, see ya. Hi, I'm back. Our 2561 has now been repaired, but it was not without its surprises. As you recall in the first section of this video, when we turned it on to bench test it, we had this ginormous buzzing sound coming out of the speaker because it had a serious failure in the power supply. And that failure and the buzzing prevented any kind of bench testing on the unit prior to working on it. Bench testing before you start is important because it clues you in on what is and isn't working and things that need to be addressed and done. But when you have a set with a severe failure, you can't do it. Rebuilding the power supply section of the 2561 involves disassembling the whole set, removing the chassis from the faceplate, a lot of disassembly of the chassis, and while you're in there, knowing that you're going to have to replace other components also, it makes the most sense to replace all of the components that you know have to be replaced due to age, just so that you don't have to take it apart and put it back together and take it apart and put it back together over and over again. You want to try to be as efficient as possible. The rebuild itself was actually interesting and somewhat more than average. Of course, we have our two primary filter capacitors. This is the one that was bad. Yes, that one. Along with it, we have a lot of small electrolytic capacitors that all need to be replaced, because they're the things that always go bad and they fail simply due to age. Of course, no rebuild would be complete without putting in a couple new light bulbs for the dial lamps. But in this particular case also, we had some unexpected surprises. The first unexpected surprise was that once it began working, it had very, very low volume, much lower than it should have been. And the other thing that we noticed right off the bat was that the two output transistors on the bottom of the chassis, they were like burning hot. They were running way too hot, and the voltage to those transistors was very high, much higher than it should have been. After some consideration and some measuring and some testing, we began looking for the cause of it. There was a comment on a previous video I made about the model 2071, which is very similar to the 2561. It's like a dual amplifier version of this. It's a stereo music intercom. Someone commented on YouTube that the germanium transistors in these type of sets rarely fail, is what he said. And I'm here to tell you that's not true. They can and do fail. Germanium transistors are not magic. They can fail just like any other component can fail. This set, if it had not been sent in for repair, was well on its way to failure. Transistors like that do not like to run burning hot. They were hot enough that you could not touch them after the set had been on for 15 or 20 minutes. And since these type of sets are designed to be left on continuously, they would have sooner or later given out. So what was the source of the problem? Well, the source of the problem were several things. We had a couple primary diodes that were questionable. We replaced some small diodes because they work in conjunction with the big diodes. But the bigger problem was one little resistor. This little resistor is why the whole set was running hot. After rebuilding part of the amplifier board and more extensively the power supply board, it now plays properly and it has the right amount of volume and it doesn't run hot anymore. Transistors in sets like these run at what I would consider to be barely warm. You really have to put your fingers on it and think about whether it's actually warm or not, and that's the way it should be. These are not stressed designs. They're not running at the edge of the safe operating limit of the components. There's a lot of leeway in these, so they last a long time. But that was not the only surprise that we had. Once we got the chassis rebuilt and we got the amplifier problem solved and we had it all set up with a little mini system, which was the master station, 2 inside remote stations, and connected to a front door speaker over there at the end of the workbench, one of the things I noticed was the radio played fine. The FM tuning was really off because the tuner had drifted a lot, so a little bit of tweaking and aligning on the FM tuner brought that back to where it was supposed to be. The AM was fine, just like it normally was. When it came time to test the intercom, we found some kind of weird operational problem. The intercom between remotes worked fine. The intercom from remote to the master worked fine. From the remotes to the front door worked fine. But the intercom functions from the master station to anywhere else were odd and intermittent and wrong. In fact, there were some times when testing the intercom by operating the controls down here, these lever switches, you would operate the lever switch and most of the time the intercom would not function correctly. However, sometimes it would. But also sometimes when you let go of the buttons, the radio wouldn't play at the master anymore. The radio always played at the remote speakers, but not here. And if you flipped them and jiggled them back and forth, sometimes it would come back on and sometimes it wouldn't. Now, we had already cleaned the switches, but I decided that, well, we'll clean them again. And I did a very extensive deep cleaning, which I've done videos about, where we used the Simichrome polish and we polished all the contacts and we made sure none of them were bent and everything looked good, and put it all back together, and it was exactly the same. I started looking more carefully at the switches, and let me show you what I found. What you're looking at are the 2 lever switches that came out of the customer's 2561. And let me explain to you how these are supposed to work and then what's wrong with them. What you have here is the lever here, which has the knob on it. The lever goes into the body of the switch down in here where you can't really see very well. There's a spring on the back, and when you move the lever, it stretches the spring either to the left or to the right, and the tension of the spring is what makes it pop back to the center. The pivot point, the center right here, is connected to a nylon disc here in the center of the switch, and attached to the nylon disc on one side is this nearly fully circular contact ring, and it has these little areas where there's little parts that poke out from the ring. As you turn it, they make different connections with the contact points around the circumference of the ring, and these lead to the terminals where wires are connected. So you've got one set on this side and another set on this side down in here where, again, you really can't see. So you just have to take my word for it. The way this is supposed to work is when you move the lever, it causes the ring to rotate, and when the ring rotates, the contacts rotate with it and make different connections between the contact points, and it makes the intercom work. It's actually pretty simple. What's wrong with this one is as you move the lever, the ring doesn't move. It's supposed to be moving in the center here, and it's not. And if we turn it over, even though you can't see, I can see the ring down here inside with the contacts on it. When I moved it the very first time to my right, it turned the ring a little bit, but then when you let it go, the ring stays where it is. It didn't move back. The ring is supposed to move back and forth with the lever and the springs. It's not supposed to turn and stay there. It doesn't like turn and stay and turn and stay and turn and stay. It always is supposed to go back to its at-rest position, so it either turns this way and goes back to the center, or it turns that way and goes back to the center. This one's not doing that. In fact, let me see if I can make it do it again. So watch the ring here. When I move it to the left, you saw it move, it rotated counterclockwise, but when I let go of the lever, it doesn't go back. It stays where it is. And if I push it this way, it went clockwise, but then it didn't spring back. So there's a problem with the nylon disc and how it keys into the shaft that's connected to the lever, and this one does the same thing. See, it moved a little bit, but it doesn't spring back. See, this one barely moves at all. It's really supposed to move probably 3 or 4 times that amount when you move the lever, and it's barely moving at all. And the same thing is true on this side. To make the intercom work, you have to have the proper connections between the disc and the contact points around its perimeter. Otherwise, the intercom doesn't work properly. In the at-rest position, with both levers centered like that, if you have the music playing, it allows the music to be heard. In this case, the reason the music would come and go is because the rings are not in the right spot, they're not making the right connections, and nothing was working correctly. This is unusual. I have not seen this particular problem with a set of these in a really long time, or ever perhaps. The more common problem on these is that the spring that gives it its tension when you rock the switch back and forth, sometimes the spring will break, it'll snap, and then you don't have any tension at all. When you move the lever, it just stays there when you let go. The spring's not a replaceable part, and the problem with the nylon circles and the contacts, this is not designed to be taken apart. This is put together once, and that's the way it stays. So I contacted the customer, explained the problem. I told him that they really need to be replaced because otherwise it's going to be unreliable and he'll be unhappy, and he agreed. Changing these out is a total pain in the neck. And I think I have some pictures of all of the connections, all the wire connections on these before I took these out, and I'll splice those into this video and see. On this one, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 contact points. Every single one has at least one wire. Some of them have 2. A couple of them have 3 wires connected to them and then soldered on. And to swap them out, you have to desolder each and every wire individually. It's wrapped through a little hole in the contact point right here. It's wrapped around to hold it in place, and then it's soldered. Every one of those has to be desoldered individually and the wire unbent and pulled back through, because no, the wires aren't long enough just to snip them off and then cut back the insulation and put them back through the holes. You actually have to disassemble the entire thing. You can unscrew the switches from the chassis, but you can't lift them all the way out because the wires aren't long enough. And there are also wires that connect the two. They're like jumper wires that connect some of the contact points between the 2 switches, so they're sort of permanently joined together. I've done this before. I've replaced these not too many times in the past, but occasionally a problem with the switch does occur. And to replace both of these, it took me a little less than 1 hour on the workbench just to replace 2 switches. And that's someone who's done this before and made sure all of the wires went back in the right place. Because that's the other problem. If you get the wires in the wrong order, then it's not going to work properly, or it'll create a problem because you're shorting wires or making connections that aren't supposed to be there. So replacing these, it's a total pain in the neck. Not fun at all. These are very high quality switches. That's why they last so long. And I've never actually seen ones that do what these do, where they don't turn correctly. My personal opinion is that either this guy was just really unlucky and he got a batch of switches that inherently have a problem after 53 years. But I think what it really is, perhaps, is that this set had a lot of residue on it from smoking, a lot of nicotine, and actually the faceplate, which is a gold faceplate, has sort of a copper tone look to it because it's, I don't know, the smoking residue has reacted with whatever the gold is, and it's turned it kind of copper tone. And I had to seriously scrub the boards and things to get the nicotine and other smoke residue off of them before I could work on them. And perhaps that was on the switches also, and perhaps somehow it affected the nylon and made it, it's not really cracked, but I'm not sure why it doesn't turn the way it's supposed to. So it's kind of unusual. And I'm not going to spend the time to take these apart because in the end, it doesn't matter all that much. We had replacements for them. These are very, very, very hard to come by nowadays. And we have a small supply of them, so that worked out. So this is kind of what happens when you can't bench test a unit before you work on it. You never know what you're going to find. Sometimes you find problems that require just general troubleshooting and component replacement, and sometimes you find a problem like that. The last thing that we had to do for this customer was he did send in one of his remote stations. This is the model 2570, and he just reported that it didn't work, didn't play music anymore, and he thought it may have a bad speaker cone, and indeed he was correct. It does have a bad speaker cone. We wired it up into our test set and it didn't play. We bypassed the original speaker cone with a temporary one just to see, and it works fine, and the intercom controls work fine. And the reason I wanted to show this really quick is this is an early one. This is from, I think his system is from 1966. In this case, he's got this is a 5-inch speaker cone. He's got the 5-inch speaker cone, which is green with the larger magnet. This was a better quality station than the ones they made later on. In fact, I read somewhere, if I can find it, I'll add it into the video. There was actually at one point, there were 2 different choices for remote stations based on what type of speaker cone they used. The green speaker cones were supposed to be a high fidelity speaker cone, whereas the aluminum colored speakers were not. And these cost a little bit more when they were brand new than the other ones did. So whether or not these are better quality, it's hard to say at this point, but that's what they said in a catalog I read. In fact, this one was made in February of 1967. So the 2561 is now repaired. It plays properly, and the customer will be happy to get it back because he told me he's having a big 4th of July barbecue party and he's going to have like 40 people over, and he's got it hooked up to his auxiliary music source so he can play his own music through the system, which is exactly what people should do, and he was very happy. It all worked out well in the end. Just some little surprises that kept it interesting. I hope you found this interesting, and perhaps it'll be helpful. If you did, and it is, give it a thumbs up on YouTube. There'll be a banner right here that shows you how to subscribe. Go to our YouTube homepage, click on the bell to receive all notifications, and every time we post a new video, you'll get a notification and you can watch it. That's all for today. See you on the next video.